Welcome to the Gospel According to Star Trek podcast. I'm Kevin C. Neese.
And I'm Mike Poteet, sitting in for Tim Van Orden, and you are listening to episode 24, Terraforming the Soul.
And we are just going to have another conversation similar to like we had last week. I had such a good time interviewing Mike about his piece. Mike's going to interview me about one of mine. So I hope you enjoy it. We're going to be talking about terraforming in Star Trek II and home soil and more. Stay with us. Well, Mike, welcome back.
Thank you. It's good to be back. Thank you
so
for
glad you're
inviting me
here.
back.
I'm glad you came. You were here. Mike was here last week as an interview guest, and now he's here as a guest host. So
I appreciate
I'm glad to have
the opportunity. It's always so fun to talk Trek with you. So I'm looking forward to it.
Definitely. Well, regular listeners will be asking, where is Tim? So Tim is going to be taking a break for a while. He's going to go on a hiatus. Not sure how long. Could be short, could be long. I don't know. But, we talk a lot on the podcast about mental health and taking care of yourself and self-care and all that sort of thing. And part of self-care is knowing when you need a break, knowing when you're getting burned out, knowing when you need a rest. And Tim's doing that right now. So I just, it's something we talk about a lot, the importance of sabbathing, the importance of rest.
Yeah. So
that's what he's doing. So I'm excited for him to take his break, and we'll venture forth and discover strange new worlds with new guest hosts and interviews and all kinds of fun stuff. So stay tuned. Mike, you get to do this week. You have Star Trek news.
I do have Star Trek news.
I don't know I don't know how the Star Trek news found you. It's amazing.
Well, the Google algorithm has somehow learned that I like Star Trek. And so when I'm trying to take a break from the real news, I tap on the Google news to see all my geeky news. And
there you go.
I found out that in theaters this week, now I will not be in theaters this week or really any time for the foreseeable future.
Right,
but for those of you out there in radio land, podcast land, who are fortunate enough to have access to movie theaters, you might try looking on Fathom Events for a documentary that's in theaters this week called Woman in Motion, Nichelle Nichols'
Nice.
Star Trek and the Remaking of NASA.
Oh.
There's been a lot of great documentaries about Star Trek and its cast in recent years. There was a documentary from George Takei about his experience in the Japanese internment of World War II and his experience as an advocate for gay and lesbian civil rights.
Mm-hmm.
There was a beautiful documentary by, I think, didn't Adam Nimoy's son do For the Love of Spock?
Yes.
That's
Adam
a
Nimoy
beautiful
did
documentary about Leonard Nimoy.
And actually, that same production team that Adam was directing that picture, but that same production team is behind the What We Leave Behind documentary.
Yes,
and also
which I
the
have
Captains.
not seen yet.
Oh my gosh, you have to see that! Oh,
well, I have it saved on my to watch later queue on YouTube because my daughter and I actually are going through Deep Space Nine right now. I haven't seen
awesome.
Deep Space Nine since its original run.
Oh, wow.
And so I'm rediscovering a lot, and we're halfway through season 4, my daughter and I. So I'm saying, as soon as I get to the end of season 7, I'm going to watch that documentary because I've heard it's a beautiful thing.
It is. It is beautiful. And Tim and I talked a couple weeks ago. They're working on a sequel to it.
Well, I heard that, and I heard there's a Voyager documentary.
Yes, and again, same production team.
Yeah. So that's another series I've not watched since its original run.
Oh, man.
Maybe have to be reduced 2 steps in rank as a Trekkie for those admissions.
No.
But there's only so many hours in the day, right?
Absolutely.
But this documentary sounds amazing because it is about Nichelle Nichols, of course, Lieutenant Uhura from the original series. And it does talk about her time in Star Trek, but apparently its main focus is her work for NASA in the 1970s after TOS had gone off the air, recruiting women and people of color and other underrepresented groups into NASA, into the astronaut corps. And apparently she told NASA that if, after her best recruiting efforts, they still didn't have a diverse enough astronaut corps and workforce, she said she was going to be NASA's worst nightmare. So apparently awesome. It's just it sounds like a wonderful film because I knew she worked with NASA, but I know I'm not fully aware of the extent to which she must have that you could make a whole documentary film about it.
That's cool.
this review of it I found on treknews.net. Give proper credit to our sources.
We'll give a link we'll leave the link in the description as always.
Yeah. So. It says, we think Woman in Motion is vital viewing for Nichols fans and any woman or minority entering the STEM workforce. Her efforts will be felt long after she is gone, and that's the sign of a true legacy if we've ever seen one.
Man, that's
so
awesome.
I'm really excited and really bummed that I can't go to the movie theater, but it is supposed to come to video on demand later in the year, so I will definitely be renting that as soon as I can.
That's exciting, man. That's awesome. I really was not aware of all that, so I'll be really interested to see that film when it's available to stream, because that's
You've
awesome.
got some Trek news too, I understand.
I do. How did you know? Yeah, so this is
the Vulcan mind link or something.
Right. This is one of those a little more on the rumor side of things, but this is an article about Michael Dorn. Wanting to do a Star Trek spinoff again. Now, I say again because a while back, several years ago, before there was Picard, before there was any of the new stuff, there were several different things that were trying to get traction. There were animated series. There was a Captain Pike TV series that was being independently produced.
Which, lo and behold.
Yeah, exactly.
Now we have coming down the pike.
Strange New Worlds on the way. Yep. But Dorn was at the time talking about a series following Worf as a captain, and apparently he's talking about that again. Not necessarily. I don't know if it's necessarily with the captain. It says Dorn's scripts seem to take place long after Worf and Picard served together on the Enterprise, which would make sense because they're all a lot older now, and so he's really focusing on the character and where he is in his position as a child of two worlds after his career at Starfleet ends, and being a captain in the not a Starfleet captain as we might have thought with like a Captain Worf idea, but a captain in the Klingon Defense Force.
Yeah.
So, and if you read the Star Trek Countdown comic, that's where they put him in that.
Okay.
They had
yes, I did read that. I would love a Worf series. I think
I would too.
Michael Dorn's a strong enough actor to carry it. The character is fascinating enough. I mean, heck, I can't think of any other character who's been on two incarnations of Star Trek to the extent that Worf was. I mean, Spock aside, of course, he showed up in many, but to be a regular character week after week on two iterations of the franchise, I don't think any other character has that.
Miles O'Brien comes close, but
you're right. You're right.
But
he had a much bigger role in Deep Space Nine than he did.
He did. Worf's role really expanded in Deep Space Nine too. But you're right, and I think I watching through Deep Space Nine, I just loved Worf more and more and more. And to the point where I'm like, yes, I'll follow him anywhere. So I hope it happens, but we'll see.
You know what I'd love for them to do if they ever did a Worf series, and I don't think they ever would because it would be too much in the weeds of fan service. But I was so annoyed at every Next Generation movie after the first one, after Generations, when Worf would show up and there'd be cursory or no explanation as to what he was doing there and how he felt about things. He had this whole other life on Deep Space Nine, and none of that ever gets referenced when he shows up back on the Enterprise for whatever the next silver screen adventure is. So I'd love for there to be some flashbacks or something, or have Troy's still around. We saw her in Picard, so have her and Worf have some kind of heart-to-heart about what it was like. I don't know.
Yeah,
and bring Riker into that conversation too. It could be cool, but I'd for sure love to see Worf's adventures in the Klingon Defense Force.
I would love to see Worf's adventures anywhere. That would just make me happy. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. The thing that Tim and I have talked about a lot, too, is that there's a ton of Star Trek like either being made or in development right now, and it's a little bit like, okay. You can slow down, guys.
How can you take it all in?
Yeah. We're a little worried about franchise fatigue. Yeah, I know. But I mean, we thought
Star Trek on TV was the syndicated reruns of the original show.
Right.
You never could have dreamed you'd have have this.
That's why I love being a Star Trek fan in this era. I kind of feel like I denigrated a couple weeks ago, growing up in the original series era. I don't mean to. I just feel like that it's good to be. I like being at this stage in life, at this stage in Star Trek. And I'm sure there are other people who grew up with the original series who are perfectly happy, and all that. And I didn't mean to denigrate it, but I'm just glad I live in the era of Star Trek that I do, and I'm glad that I discovered it when I discovered it, and have grown with it as I've grown with it. I've felt like it's been a really great place to be. So.
And it's much more fun, I have found, not just with Star Trek fandom, but with some of my other geeky interests, Star Wars, Doctor Who. It's much more fun just to expose yourself to the new thing, the new version coming along, and maybe you'll love it, maybe you won't really like it, whatever. But, open yourself to the possibilities, right?
Yeah.
So not everything about Discovery has been my cup of tea, and Lower Decks, okay. And I was a little disappointed in Picard in some respects, but we could talk about that other times. But
Yeah.
I would never consider just not watching it because it's Star Trek, And,
Exactly.
And I've always said the worst hour of Star Trek is better than most other hours of television you'll find anywhere else. So,
That is the truth. That is the truth. I mean, I don't know if that's always true, but
generally true.
I'm thinking of some of the episodes you and I discussed.
My best friend in high school and I, when we were watching when this was 1985, 86, when there was only original series reruns and the movies. We would often tell ourselves that if we were sitting through Spock's brain or whatever, that, well, yeah, but
at least it's Star
I'll
Trek.
take Spock's brain over a daytime soap opera anyway.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. And hey, even bad Star Trek, you can find good in most of the time. Like,
absolutely.
It's good.
We talked about that some last week.
We did.
Omega Glory, looking at you.
Yeah, that's right. Well, speaking of last week, as we were going through your piece on cracks about the book, talking about sacred texts and Star Trek. If you haven't listened to that episode, go check it out. We're gonna flip it a little bit this week, and you're kind of gonna interview me about my piece, Terraforming the Human Soul, which also appeared on Trektember last year.
It did, and I loved it because, as I've perhaps given away, kind of my Star Trek is that era of the late 80s. Well, I should say the whole decade, because my real introduction to Star Trek, although I had seen an episode here and there beforehand as a young kid, but when I got to watch Star Trek II on HBO in 1982, I was really hooked, and I consider those original series movies kind of my Star Trek. Not that I don't love a lot else of it. I do. I like the original series, like The Next Generation. I'm really enjoying rediscovering Deep Space Nine. And I do like a lot. I think Discovery keeps getting stronger and stronger the longer it goes on. But those movies, and it's funny because lots of original series fans say, well, or at least they said back then, maybe the controversy in air quotes has died down, but they'd say, well, you're not really seeing Star Trek at its best. It's all about space battles and teeth gnashing villains, and I get it. I hear those criticisms, but Star Trek II was like my paradigmatic Star Trek. So I really loved seeing you in this article. You take not only Star Trek II, but also Star Trek III and Star Trek IV, and an episode of The Next Generation for good measure, and you trace the theme of terraforming through all of them. And you said my idea would never have occurred to you. Well, your idea would never have occurred to me, because I don't know. It was great to see how you looked at these films. So I was hoping you'd talk us through the thumbnail of how you handle each of these things in your article, which, as I read it, your basic premise is that Star Trek says technology in and of itself is never automatically a good thing or a bad thing, but it's how we use it.
Right. Well, and that's kind of where the piece came from. I wrote it for a book. I mentioned this last week. I wrote it for a book that I co-edited with a friend of mine called Mark Boone. It's called Science Fiction and the Abolition of Man: Finding C.S. Lewis in Sci-Fi Films and Television. And it's published by Pickwick Publications. It actually came out just right on the heels of my first book, The Gospel According to Star Trek: The Original Crew, and we were trying to. So it's a multi-author work. There are lots of different contributors, and what we did was we took C.S. Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man, and its three main segments, and just sort of hung our essays on those coat hooks. And just sort of, instead of specifically trying to always reference Lewis, what we did was use Lewis as a springboard and a context, so that each collection of essays in the three parts of the book relates to the themes that Lewis is talking about in that part of Abolition of the Man. And
I don't mean to interrupt,
No,
but
yeah.
I'm embarrassed to admit I don't believe I have read Abolition of Man. So what is the quick Cliff Notes version of Abolition of Man?
The Abolition of Man really has to do with the finding and keeping of our humanity. I think that's the best way to put it. And how easy it is to lose it in a modern context.
Okay.
And so, the section that I wrote in specifically, we were talking about one of the things we really wanted to discuss from a science fiction angle, and we have lots of different kinds of science fiction in the book. But one of the things we really wanted to talk about was our relationship to technology, because that's one of the ways in which we can find the abolition of man, where, like I talk about in the article, sort of our technological development outpaces our spiritual development, our moral development. And so that's something that Star Trek talks about a lot. And I decided to just kind of dial in directly on terraforming, simply because it's I think probably it's one of the most godlike powers that's discussed in Star Trek. And I got to go into, like you said, Star Trek 2 and 3 and stuff that I was already thinking about in my book, which I was writing at the time. And some of the places I knew I wasn't going to go in my chapters on those films, but that I was really interested in. So I just kind of used that as a springboard. And terraforming, of course, being taking a dead planet and making it alive, basically, very basically.
Right. Yeah. You referenced that wonderful scene in Star Trek II where Kirk, Spock, and McCoy are discussing the Genesis project.
Right.
And McCoy has this reflective moment. Good Lord, if anyone were to use this in the wrong, he basically invokes the name of the Lord, I think just kind of conversationally. I don't know what the character's religious beliefs have ever been established, but he does make that kind of intuitive connection that reshaping existing worlds in this way, and beyond that, life where no life existed, which is the intent of the Genesis project, that it is a godlike power. And he says, when Spock in the extended cut, as you point out, says, I don't mean that in the wrong hands of, McCoy cuts him off. Whose are the right hands, he says.
Right.
And I wondered if you had any thoughts about whether the movie comes down on, obviously Khan's hands are the wrong hands. He's only out to use the Genesis torpedo as a destructive weapon. But do you think Star Trek II dances around or evades the question of whose might be the right hands for something like Genesis?
I think McCoy's question may be a statement in itself. I think McCoy, because in the scene, they watched Carol Marcus's video pitch for the Genesis device, first fully CGI sequence in a motion picture, by the way.
That's right.
And they watch that, and then Kirk says it literally is Genesis, the power of creation, and they specifically call it the power of God, and McCoy is taken aback, and he's just like, do you really think that we have the maturity? Do you think we have the intelligence, to do this? And I really miss that line in the director's cut, in the theatrical edition, where Spock says, where Spock, he says, I wasn't attempting to make a moral assessment, admittedly in the wrong hands. And McCoy cuts him off and says, in the wrong hands. Would you mind telling me whose are the right hands, my logical friend? Yeah. And Spock really doesn't have a response to that. And I think that is the statement I think I wish that was in. I wish so many things from the director's cut were in the theatrical cut of the film, because the director's cut is not as readily available. At least in its best form, which, by the way, is the director's edition DVD, not the Blu-ray. Because the Blu-ray cuts some stuff out that I like.
Oh, does it really?
Yeah,
I
just
think
a couple of lines.
I have them
couple
both,
moments.
but I've only watched the DVD
Yeah,
versions.
and then there's some visual choices, like a planet that used to be red is now blue and stuff like that. That I'm just like, why? This is confusing. The Blu-ray is a little weird. So for me, it's the DVD. But anyway, point being that I feel like when McCoy asked that question, I think the audience is meant to ask that question too. And that's why I really wish it existed in the theatrical version of the film. But even without that, the whole idea that we're talking about, that this is the power of God, that this is the power of creation, is a very important thing. And man, I just almost don't know what to do with the film thematically without that line. You know, whose hands are the right hands. I mean, I do, but in this particular context, you know, I feel like, yeah. Well, I wouldn't say it's the thematic key to the movie, but I believe, for me, it's a really great kind of keystone for this conversation within the movie. Like, if you're going to talk about this movie as having any sort of opinion about whether or not we should be doing this, I think that line is important.
What's interesting to me is there's nothing in the film in Star Trek II to suggest that the Genesis team's hands are the wrong hands, right? They're all presented as, well, we really only get to know Carol and David, and we know there's 30-something years, spoiler alert, there's stuff about David we'll learn in Star Trek 3, and we'll talk about that.
Right.
But just looking at Star Trek 2 on its own, we have no reason to suspect these people are anything but intelligent, principled, ethical scientists.
Right.
And they've thought through this very clearly, what they're doing. And now something about them, though, that your article in its longer chapter form in the book made me think of, and lifted up something I'd never noticed. All the times I've seen Star Trek 2, it's my favorite Star Trek movie. All the times I've seen it, I've never gotten stuck on Carol Marcus's line in her proposal, when we consider the cosmic problems of overpopulation and food supply, the value of this becomes clear. When that struck me, reading it in your article, I thought, aren't those the kind of problems the Federation has solved? Especially when we get into the next generation. But so it struck me that, why have I never noticed that part of the motivation for Genesis is to alleviate these problems? So,
yeah,
roundabout way of saying, they seem to have nothing but the best of motives for doing this.
Yeah, and I think you're right in that assessment, and I think, as far as, like, if you're going to do this, right, what's the most principled, ethical way to do it? And I think the film really sets that up when Carol says, you boys have to be clear on this. There can't be so much as a microbe or the show's off.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's this great humility before life, which I think is really important throughout Star Trek. But this great humility before life to say that if there is any life on this planet at all that could eventually, possibly, millions of years down the line, develop into some intelligent species, or someone, right? We don't want to truncate their history. We don't want to play God with their futures. Like, that's a very fourth dimensional way of thinking about scientific progress, and a very, I think, careful and astute way of thinking about it. And so, yeah, in that regard, I do think that, Carol Marcus and her vision may be ultimately kind of vindicated by the film to a degree. But of course, there's a back and forth in the book version of the article with David Brin that I construct. David Brin has this thing in one of the special features for Star Trek 3, which we'll talk about later, where he compares the story of the Genesis planet to Frankenstein. And his thing is that Star Trek 2 says this is a good thing that we've done, because everybody's happy and smiling on the bridge when the Genesis planet is formed. But it's less about that and more about that. I mean, it's new life is springing forth, and we've just lost Spock, and it's in the context of Spock's sacrifice that Spock saved us, and remembering Spock, and all of that, and really, I think the narration from Kirk hints at coming back here to try to restore Spock in the future, possibly, because this place is life from lifelessness. So,
Yeah.
you know, I don't know if that can be necessarily seen as a complete vindication of the technology itself and whether it's the right thing to do or not. Nor do I think necessarily that Star Trek 3 says anything broadly about the technology itself either. I think there's another story
Right.
going on in Star Trek 3.
Yes, and
So-
I want to come back to that. I was thinking, though, on the humility part, the other note in Carol Marcus's video pitch, which I have kind of noted from time to time, is this device will produce a planet capable of supporting whatever life forms we see fit to deposit on it.
Yes.
And there's something about B.B. Besh's delivery of that line that's always struck me as that there's a note of, I wouldn't go so far as to call it hubris or arrogance, but it's
Right.
very much, and once this beautiful new world exists, we will be in charge. We will
Right.
call the shots.
Right.
And so I wonder if there isn't an element there of something to be aware of, at least. You know, if we're going to take it into the real world, we could say that people involved in such research is there is a real interest in terraforming and real science, real world
Right.
science.
Right.
But anybody in the sciences, even when you're doing it from the best of, and this I guess is true of anything in life, right? This is the human condition. Even when you're doing anything for the best of motives and in the most principled way you know how, you know, there's still the temptation to play God, and
Yes.
even if it's on a much smaller scale than creating a new world. And as far as the David Brin piece goes, I really enjoy the dialogue you have with him in your piece.
Yeah.
And I do agree with you that scene is more about Spock's death and what it means. But I will say, when Kirk says he feels young at the end of the movie, Carol had told him back on Regula in the Genesis cave that when he sees that, he would feel young as when the world was new.
Right.
So I think maybe Brin is not altogether correct, but maybe not altogether incorrect either.
Right. No, I agree with that. And I'll say, too, you talk about terraforming making you feel a little godlike. That's going to come in when we get to our Next Generation part and Homestuck.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, yeah, the Bryn thing, yeah, I mean, he's got a point. I don't think he's totally wrong, but I do feel, and of course, maybe it's just the theological interpretation I have of the film, you know. I see it as Spock having rescued him.
Yes.
That process is what makes Kirk feel young. That because he's been saved, because he's been renewed and restored.
Reborn.
And
yeah.
yes.
Born again.
Right. And so
Yeah.
that Edenic imagery, I think, is really important when Carol takes him to the cave and says, you know, let me show you something that will make you feel young as when the world was new. I mean, that's a reference to Eden. There are many, many references to Eden all throughout the original series and the original crew movies. It's a big symbol. Yeah.
Stepping into Eden.
Right.
Brother. Which I have to say, having seen it not that long ago on H&I's All Star Trek, they didn't pay me to plug, but I will. I think that may be one of those Star Treks where it gets underrated. And
I think you're right.
I think there's a lot, but let's save that for another time.
We'll talk about that another time. But yeah, when you get into see, I'm not sure. This is the thing. I'm not sure how much either Star Trek 2 or Star Trek 3 are focused in any way on making a statement about the power of terraforming and whether we should use it or not.
I think that's a fair assessment. Yeah.
I do think that McCoy's question is a statement. You know, it's a statement by McCoy. You know, and is it the statement of the film on terraforming? I don't know. I don't know that you can pull it that way. I really feel like what Bryn has done is so generalized it that he's missed the point. And because his thesis is, okay, in Star Trek 2, we get the idea that everything's all well and good. It is okay for us to, as he says, pick up God's tools or go to the garage and unroll the blueprints, and all that. It's okay for us to do that. We are good. We can do this. This is all right. This is a good thing that we have done. And then in the third picture, he says, well, that just undermines everything, because then this is the Frankenstein mythos. This is where, David has played God, and now he's going to be punished for it. And
right. Let's get into David, because it annoys me no end. Apart from your article, I've always had. I like Star Trek 3 a lot. I think in some ways it's got the most heart of all the original series films. But it annoys me no end that they felt they had to discredit David. Because again, there's no indication in Star Trek 2 that anybody's doing anything they shouldn't be. But we find out in Star Trek 3. David used protomatter to this notoriously unstable element that every ethical scientist in the universe has condemned.
Right.
He used it to cut corners, to not do the work. It always seemed to me, if you were going to have a story where the Genesis planet had to be unstable, you didn't need an explanation beyond it was created from a nebula and not used as it was intended to be used, right? It was intended to be used on a pre-existing dead planet. But I like what you do in your article. It helps me come to peace with Star Trek 3 a little, because I think you're making a theological connection that the flaws of the Genesis planet and the flaws of David are interwoven. Right. And that makes me think of the fall in Christian theology, how our flaws, our sins, are inextricably part of our experience of creation now. I'll let you say more.
Yeah,
Am I on the right track of what you're arguing there?
Right, that all of creation is broken, and through Christ all of creation is redeemed. That it's not just us in our individual lives. It's us as a human community, and it's all of the cosmos. Which the creation groans, right? Yeah, right. And so that really speaks to me, and that really echoes for me. To me, I've said that Star Trek 3. I'll unpack it now for our listeners who may not be familiar, but I do talk in the book Gospel According to Star Trek: The Original Crew about Spock as a Christ figure in Star Treks 2, 3, and 4. And there's really a remarkably rich Christology that you can unpack in those 3 films, which is entirely unintended, although it's awfully handy that we keep talking about Eden and things like that. But and also sacrificial death and all those kinds of things. And some of it I can't. I mean, some of it, especially in Star Trek 3, is so on the nose that I'm just like, that has to be intentional. It has to be. You have Spock's friends going to his tomb and finding his body gone and his clothes folded. I'm like, come on.
Right.
So for me, it's I don't know how much it's intentional, how much it's not, but I assume it's entirely unintentional. But anyway,
I think you can be intentional about having a character be a Christ figure without necessarily trying to advance any kind of theology.
Well, that's very true. That's very true. You can borrow something in a literary way.
You're tapping into like one of the most viscerally powerful archetypes in Western mythology.
Right,
there.
absolutely. And so there's always the question about what's intended and what's not. And I don't try to be I don't have a crystal ball about that. If nobody's said anything, I can't. I just have to shrug and say, "Oh, nobody seems to, have this in mind," and just go from there, because that's the safest position. But so yes, the groanings of creation and all of that, definitely is involved. But here's the thing: from a writing standpoint, I feel like the Genesis device was something that is so powerful, right, and so desirable because of not only its creative force but also its destructive force, that it had to kind of be written away. It's like when you're watching an episode of Star Trek and this character gets inserted and they're so big and they cause such seismic shifts that they have to die by the end of the episode, because if they hang around, we're just going to have a completely different show from now on. The changes have to be reset. And the Genesis device, it's like it would have continued to be this political football. It would have continued to be like the H-bomb of the Star Trek world, and that might have been something that Harv Bennett wanted to get out from under.
I suppose so.
So by undermining, so to your point, like saying that the Genesis planet is unstable because it's nebula, sure, that's perfectly valid. But I feel like the intention was to undermine the technology itself, so that this doesn't go on and be something we have to deal with for the rest of Star Trek.
Although, does the revelation that David changed what does
Change
Saavik
the conditions
say
of the
to him?
test.
So, like
does
your
that
father,
echo his father?
You
Yeah, it
change
does.
the rules or something.
It does. In fact,
Now,
Saavik makes that exact parallel.
Does doing that discredit Genesis fundamentally? Because David, none of the other scientists presumably knew he was doing this.
Right, and that's the thing. It doesn't fundamentally discredit the technology itself. It doesn't fundamentally discredit terraforming itself, but it does speak to that Star Trek theme of not allowing our impatience or ambition to cause us to do things to make sacrifices and cut corners that we shouldn't.
Yeah.
And to let our technological growth outpace our moral development. There's a conversation similar to this in the terrible episode, Last Outpost, that introduces the Ferengi in Next Generation.
Yes.
There's a conversation that Riker and Portal have about this need to have a moral or ethical fortitude in order to be able to wield power. Otherwise, you're going to start causing problems.
Right.
And the thing I say in this piece is, probably the worst sin you can commit in Star Trek is playing God. Even though it's arguable that we kind of do it from time to time, especially in the original series. But anyway, I don't think that it's about the character. It's about the character's journey and his death. And I think this is a really important part. His death is not the judgment against him. His death is his salvation. His death is when he redeems himself, because Saavik is going to die. Spock can't do anything about it because McCoy, as he says, has all his marbles.
Right.
So he's just there. The only one with moral agency who can act is David. And, maybe David doesn't deserve to die for what he did, but he does feel that guilt. But he also doesn't want anybody else to die on his account. And he does the noble thing and fights the Klingon officer and loses his life. And I think that's really, really powerful, and that's really noble. And it ties into the whole theme of sacrificial death in these three films. And so I think it's beautiful. I think it works great. And I think Bryn's idea is that, that the monster is killing the creator, but the Genesis planet isn't killing him. And he's not, if he was, unrepentant and the Genesis planet was, pulling him down into the lava and he was like, I was right, and, whatever, then yes. Okay, fine.
Right. The
Frankenstein.
one who the planet actually consumes is Krug,
who
wants to possess it for, again, destructive.
Yes.
Not possess the planet per se, but the technology that created
possess the Genesis.
So there's a judgment death in that film.
Yeah.
Assisted by Kirk's boot to his face, but
three though, 3 kicks: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
It's a Trinitarian face bashing. I never thought about that.
Well, I talk about Krug as this satanic figure, this Luciferian figure.
Oh for sure.
And so because he's like or an antichrist, and so I talk about how he's come to steal, kill, and destroy, and then with 3 kicks, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, he's thrown into the lake of fire. It's like a final judgment at the end of the world, when the world is breaking and everything. So it's just there. I like to talk about there's a lot of biblical imagery or sneaky or things that can be interpreted biblically in Star Trek 3. I talk about it as scripture jazz. It's not just straight note for note, but it's all there. It's just jumbled up and shuffled around, and you just have to look for it. It's there. So
I like it.
It's cool.
I like it. Well, that's a good segue that the technology itself isn't discredited, because by the time of the Next Generation, the Federation is still doing this. And you bring up the episode Home Soil from TNG's first season, where the Enterprise goes to planet Valera 3, and they meet Mandel, a scientist who Troy says has remarkable achievements in terraforming. So he's been doing this successfully, apparently, for quite a while. But tell us a little bit about what unfolds on the Valera 3 terraforming project.
What's interesting about the first thing to look at is, again, when they walk in, they see Louisa, and she's one of the scientists there, and she introduces herself as a gardener of Edens, and says that terraforming makes you feel a little godlike. And so again, there's that echo from Star Trek II, right? But what's really different about this kind of terraforming is that it's very slow, and it's very careful, and it's not all done at once with a big bomb. And so I think the sort of retcon that we can have in our heads is that this sort of rushed way that David wanted to do it, and they I guess Carol, you could say too, had in mind, because she was really the project lead. That sort of rush to get it done quickly has failed, and failed phenomenally. And so the Federation, in order to continue to work on this technology, has had to go with slower, more careful, more measured methods that don't cut corners the way David does. So we're looking at sort of almost an idealized, like a lot of things in Next Generation, an idealized version of what came before.
Yeah.
And so Director Mandel is obsessed with his work. And Deanna talks about that frequently, going with the profile of a terraformer, that they're just super obsessed with their work. But while they're there, Mandel is not interested in them coming down to the planet. But Jean-Luc, being Jean-Luc, says, well, we're coming down anyway. And because he's suspicious, because this guy wants to push them away. Seems like he's hiding something.
Well, I was going to say, because Troy, early in the Next Generation, that's pretty much all she could report was he's hiding something.
Right. So, but they go down, and while they're there, one of the scientists is killed, and apparently murdered, and not killed accidentally, but killed on purpose. And they set about trying to solve the mystery of the scientist's death. And Mandel is somebody they suspect for a while because he's so obsessive, but he very forthrightly insists, I create life, I don't take it.
Yeah.
And that, to me, again, shows that there's a moral fortitude in him, right? But he still, I think, makes mistakes. He still lets the desire get the better of him because, as we find out in the episode, what they're doing is evaporating all this water that's in the sand, in this sandy layer of the planet's crust, in order to make it suitable, right? And when they're doing that, what they're doing is obliterating these microscopic life forms that live in there, that they don't recognize as life forms because they're silicon-based and not carbon-based.
Right.
And so even though these life forms have been trying to show them geometric shapes, and things that would say, hey, we're here, we're alive, they've been kind of brushing it aside and ignoring it because they've been assured over and over and over by the best scientific minds in the Federation that there's no life on this planet at all. And of course, you're not looking for life where there's silicon. And the great line that Mandel has is, we weren't looking, so we did not see.
It is a great line.
And I was like, yes.
Yeah, and I wonder, you say that he lets the desire get the better of him, and that could be. He certainly is obsessive, about his work. We hear several times. But even if we're not obsessive or driven about something, we just become so used to certain ways of looking at things, we don't see alternatives. We don't see other possibilities. I am amused that it's a silicon life form they don't recognize when, the original Enterprise discovered the Horta, however long ago it was. So the Federation's got some experience of silicon-based life.
That's true.
But,
good call.
But that aside, that fanish nitpick aside, it is a great object or morality play.
Yes,
And it has some
is.
other similarities with Devil in the Dark. These scientists, it's miners in Devil in the Dark, but in Home Soil it's scientists. But it's these outsiders coming to a world that's not theirs, and their work unintentionally. There's no malice, there's no ill will,
Right.
but they're destroying life, and destroying not just life, but the future generation of that life. The Horde is concerned for the silicon nodules, the nursery, her babies, and the micro brains, as they're called in Home Soil. They're concerned about being able to expand and, propagate.
Yeah.
Live, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's these two morality plays in Star Trek of humans inadvertently, but undeniably destroying life and life's future.
Which again, I think, like you can't fault Mandel or anybody on the team very much, because what they saw was so strange. You can't fault them too much, but they do bear some blame, but they come by it honestly, as we might say. But it does sort of continue that conversation from Star Trek II about the impact of this work, and that it's so important to have such humility before life that you don't want any possibility of erasing something that will potentially become sentient later on down the line. And I think that's really, really a very sacred view of life that I think very few people really hold on to. Even among Christians, I think there are a lot of ways in which we actually ignore the sacredness of life for certain forms of expediency, or for certain social pressures or other things. We either are willing to accept a certain level of death, even death that we cause, even in innocent people, or we are willing to accept a certain level of death because we've decided that those are evil people, or those are bad people, or they don't matter, or we're willing to let people's lives be compromised and let people be oppressed or pushed to the side because we just don't recognize their humanity. So there's such a gulf between this kind of real sacredness, real honor for life that we see in this discussion of terraforming in these two parts of Star Trek, and often how irreverent we are before life. Now I think of Ian Malcolm in Jurassic Park.
Yes,
saying the lack of reverence before nature is appalling. And in fact,
it finds a way.
My son's a big Jurassic World fan. We were just talking about this the other day, about the implications of Jurassic Park. He says a lot of people think it's just dinosaurs, running around and eating people, but it's really about, he said it in his own way, and I wish I could say it, but it's really about how, we can't be, we're not all we think we are, basically. It's really about showing us some humility. And I said, yeah, and the humility that we have to have when we use our technology. And I specifically thought about this piece.
Absolutely. Well, it's
this part of Star Trek.
So obvious there as you exegete it, and it's humility, and also I think in the piece you mentioned compassion.
Yes.
When Picard, I believe it's Picard, tells the microbrains near the end of the episode, all life is beautiful to us. You really believe it. I mean, you believe that he believes it. He's not just saying something to save the ship or whatever. It's not some kind of Corbomite maneuver.
Right. Even though we are, in their eyes, say it with me, kids, ugly, giant bags of mostly water. It's like whenever I'm talking about Home Soil and people are like, what episode is that? I'm like, ugly, giant bags of mostly water. They're like, oh yeah, that one. Oh, I know. All you think about is that little light in the bell jar in the medical bay. But yeah, it's so much more, and such a great, and I think a really carefully crafted story which is not something that people generally think of in the first season of Next Generation.
That's right.
People
That's
just
right.
write off the first season of Next Generation like it's just terrible and there's nothing good about it. And I'm like,
of real gems
every
in there.
episode of Next Generation isn't Code of Honor, people. There's great stuff in there,
Thankfully.
you know. And this is one of them. I think it's a really excellent episode. But again, it continues this great conversation about terraforming, which is great to talk about because it is such a godlike power. But we think of other godlike powers that we have now, and Star Trek talks about it in Star Trek 2 and later on in Deep Space Nine, talking about eugenics. Which another great source for talking about that is the film Gattaca, which I think is a sci-fi classic, absolutely beautiful from 1996. Check it out if you haven't seen it. But but that whole idea that we can actually, you know, there are all these benefits, right? There are all these good things that we can talk about with different forms of genetic manipulation, and yet the evil of it, or the potential for evil of it, is so great that the Federation ends up outlawing it.
Yeah. Which is not something that happens. There's not too many technological lines Starfleet / the Federation are not willing to cross.
Right.
But that's one of the charms of the vision of humanity that Star Trek puts out, is that when we are mature, we will learn to restrain ourselves.
Right.
You know, there's some mundane examples like the Federation just decides, even though we know about cloaking device technology, we're not going to use it. Defiance the exception, I suppose, in Deep Space Nine. But I know some fans are upset with this idea that no military organization would just decide not to use a and no, not in our world, but in Star Trek's world,
and
the Federation says we don't need that. We don't sneak around. That's not who we are. And your piece starts off talking about, you know, our values. If we give up our values, we don't know who we are anymore.
Yes, it's a great line from Janeway, actually. Is what that is. If we abandon our values, we lose our humanity. That's just so important in Star Trek. That's so important is talking about what it is that makes us human, as opposed to just, you know, alive.
Well, in contrast to the cloaking device piece, there's an episode in the last season of Next Generation called Force of Nature, where there's a realization similar, I think, to what is happening in home soil. You know, these terraformers realize what they've been doing is contrary to who they really are at their core. They just didn't know it. And at the end of Force of Nature, once it's come out that warp speed is actually causing ruptures in time-space, and you know, Starfleet's going to start limiting how fast ships can go. Picard says, you know, all my life I've loved space, and I've devoted my life to exploring space, and it turns out I've been contributing to its destruction. You know, it's a not too subtle allegory of climate change, I think. And it's not a great episode. I really appreciate where its message is, and it only gets more important over time, but it's not executed so well. But they quickly forgot about that warp speed limit. The writers did, you know.
Yeah.
There's a by the end of the series, they're going warp 9 again all the time.
Right.
You know. So even in the vision of Star Trek, it's hard to exercise that restraint, that humility, that compassion before creation, before life. I was struck as I read your piece, and you come to this conclusion about compassion in the very first episode with Captain Kirk, where no man has gone before. What does Gary Mitchell do to demonstrate his godlike powers? He creates a garden on that desolate planet, Delta
complete
Vega.
with Catharian apples.
Yes, complete with the apples. And as Kirk is, you know, the big climactic speech against Mitchell is, above all else, a god needs compassion.
Amen, Captain Kirk.
You know, compassion and humility. You know, we think about what's godlike. Oh, omniscience, omnipotence, and of course Christians believe God has those attributes. But texts like Philippians 2 tell us that you know, he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, and you know, Jesus shows us what real divinity is. It is about humility and compassion.
Right.
And it's so strange to think about God exercising humility, but it's out of love, right? putting yourself at the service of another, as God puts God's self at our service in Christ. So again, I don't think Star Trek's trying to preach the gospel, but darned if the Spirit doesn't have its way.
It just does. Well, and it's like I've said many times. I've said it on the podcast. I've said it many places. But God created us as humans to be humans and not anything else. And so it's only when we understand deeply what it means to be human that we can understand what it means to be human to the glory of God. Because we glorify God by being good humans, right? And being fully human, robustly engaged in our humanity. And also that if that humanity then is, if the gospel is what we say it is, which is the satisfaction for our human longings and the point of why we're here, then when we talk deeply about what it means to be human, we ought to find ourselves bumping up against the gospel. And we do that all the time in Star Trek, and we do it here. And I think it's very important that we continue in these conversations to focus on the development of moral character, the development of a worldview and a vision that values and respects life, and like we said, the development of compassion and real compassion. Really listening to someone else, even though they call you an ugly giant bag of mostly water, really listening, even though you have to overcome a language barrier. Why don't
they see us as beautiful, right?
Right. Even though you have to overcome a language barrier, even though they seem threatening to you, in the way they're expressing themselves, even though you don't understand them and you don't know what to do with them, still listening, still refraining from judgment, and still seeking to be compassionate toward them. I don't know what else it is we're supposed to do, as we need to do as Christians, especially in this time of so much. Well, and not that our time, I think, is all that much worse than other times have been in many ways. It's just more on the surface. It's been recorded more. It's been distributed more. We're more aware of it. And, you have to know how bad the infection is before you can really get rid of it, or at least combat it. I mean, obviously we know ultimately, theologically, the infection that is the sinful nature of humanity doesn't go away. But you know what? We are the ones who are called to combat it and to make this world the best place it can be, to be the best humans we can be always, all the time. And that's what Star Trek calls us to. So.
Yeah, and in the context of technology, for all we talk about Eden in these Star Trek stories, the Bible's ultimate vision of the redeemed world, the new creation, the new heaven, the new earth, isn't going back to the garden. It's the new Jerusalem. It's a new city. Right. It's as though God gathers up everything that is good that humans have done and perfects it.
And we build a new city together. We are co-creators with God.
The things we do in our lives, though not ultimate, they are of value and they have worth. And God will keep what is good and get rid of the rest.
Right.
and supply all we lack.
Right. Exactly. So I think when we're talking about this stuff, terraforming is such a big thing. But I think it's great that science fiction and Star Trek gives us the ability to talk about things on this scale, because once we're talking on this scale, then we can reduce it to smaller scales. Yeah. And we can look at those values and how we apply them in our everyday lives. Yeah. And I think that's really important. So I hope that as our listeners continue to contemplate these things, that they will allow for the terraforming of their own souls. Because that's what God is doing in all of us.
Amen to that.
Yeah, being transformed by the renewing of our minds. It's a daily task. So let's keep at it. So normally at the end of an episode, we do an audience question. But this week, since Mike is our guest host and we just want to celebrate his presence, we're going to let Mike ask a random Mike question. And
celebrate my presence. My goodness.
Yes.
You're a very gracious host, sir.
Well, thank you. And you're a very gracious guest host.
Well, thank you. So
So what's your question, Mike?
Since we were talking about Star Trek 2, 3, and 4,
Yeah.
here's the burning question I want to know, because I have very strong feelings about it. I want to
Okay.
know what yours are. We have not discussed this in advance.
No.
Who's the better Saavik and why? Robin Curtis or Kirstie Alley?
Okay. I have great affection for them both. As Saavik, I think they're both really honorable. I feel like Robin plays Saavik as she needs to be played in Star Trek 3, and I feel like Kirstie plays Saavik as she needs to be played in Star Trek 2. And I don't mean that to be a cop-out. They both feel tonally right for their films. But maybe that's just because I'm used to them being there.
Well, that's a very good, nuanced answer, but that's no fun.
That's no fun.
Who's your favorite Saavik, Kevin?
On the whole, see, and the thing is this, I also have a bias against recasting roles. So my tendency is to go with Kirstie.
That's
even
the
though,
right answer.
I knew you'd say that. I knew and I think Tim and I have talked about this before. It's like it depends on which movie you see first. If you saw Star Trek 3 first, then Robin Curtis is your Saavik.
Sure,
and if you saw
obviously
Star Trek 2 first, then Kirstie Alley is your Saavik. That's almost always the way it goes. I admire Robin Curtis a lot, but I honestly have to say that, I mean, there's that backstory that we don't get on screen.
That's
that
right.
Saavik
It's not
is
technically canonical.
right. That Saavik is supposed to be part Romulan.
Yep.
And so Kirstie plays that more. But really more that's kind of an excuse for Kirstie's less than Vulcan performance. But then on the other hand, we have Robin, who's trying to go much more pure Vulcan, and she was directly under the tutelage of Leonard Nimoy.
That's right, and he told her that's how he wanted the role played. So.
Right. I mean, he was very much coaching her as her director, but I still feel like because she is, I mean, I just, seeing her in interviews and listening to her talk about herself, she is a very emotions on the surface kind of person. She's very emotive, very emotionally engaged, and just expresses her. You know, it's one of those people who just, who was it? I can't remember what director was saying that some actors have open faces and some actors have closed faces. And the actors with closed faces are the ones who are like hard to read, and you don't know for sure what their emotions are. And the ones with open faces they can't hide their emotions no matter what they do. You know exactly what their character is feeling and thinking just by looking at their face. Robin has a very open face, and that works against her in playing a Vulcan, because when she delivers lines like "David is dead," you can see Robin Curtis, the actor, trying very hard to not cry about that.
Yes.
Whereas Saavik shouldn't have any trouble with it at all, and so when she delivers a line like that, she goes way too cold. David is dead, like she's a robot or something, trying to deliver the line as emotionlessly as she can. And I think that works against her. So for me, like I that part of her performance, even though I'm used to it, and I love Robin Curtis, I think she's great. And those are only moments. For the most part, I find her to be just great as Saavik. She works. There are those moments where I feel like it feels strained. But that for me kind of that takes me out of the movie a little bit. Her performance takes me out of the movie a little bit in those ways. And so I tend to go toward Kirstie, even though we can definitely rag on Kirstie for not being as purely Vulcan as she should be. But she's also not written as purely Vulcan. They write her swearing, for goodness sakes, in her first scene. I mean, come on.
Yes, but even though it didn't make the final cut, there is footage of Spock telling Kirk she's half Romulan. Jim.
That's right.
So,
that's right.
I mean, it would have been canonical and should have been canonical.
Should have been.
I'm so sad that it isn't.
It's not in the director's cut, is it?
Go ahead.
It's not in the director's cut, is it? I don't think it is.
No, it's only in. If you go to a blog called Collecting Trek. The guy who did the blog, and I wish I knew his name, but I've only discovered it recently, so my apologies. We can add a link in the show notes maybe. But somebody involved with the production gave him what's called product roles that they show to theaters to try to convince them to book the film.
Right.
And so there is footage of that, of Spock and Kirk's exchange about Saavik's half Romulan ancestry, parentage. So it's such a crime that those scenes aren't even. Why Nick Meyer didn't put them back in the director's cut, I don't know, because they were filmed and finished, and they would have added so much to Saavik, and I can only, in all seriousness, I agree with you. I think they're both excellent in what they have to do and what they were tasked to do. And Leonard Nimoy decided Saavik's going to be Vulcan, and I don't really have issues with the way Robin delivers that line of David is dead. I think Vulcans do have emotions.
Yeah, they do.
Just suppress them, and I think you see, if her Saavik is pure Vulcan, which she is meant to be, I think you see the struggle to come to terms with that in the way she delivers that line. I don't find it cold or robotic. But I know lots of people do, and I respect that opinion.
Yeah.
And I
you
can
might
see
be right.
why they didn't keep her around for Star Trek 4, really, because she's just a problematic character at that point.
Yeah, the character didn't have anything to do, yeah.
She was supposed to be pregnant with Spock's child after Pon farr on Genesis Planet. And
what would have been so good? It would have been so good if someone had written a story about what happened to Saavik's child. Who could have done that, and where could we find it?
No.
If there was a book out there, maybe called Strange New Worlds 2. I'll bet somebody could find a story like that.
It's still available as an ebook. It makes a great gift. But no, I knew I wanted to. They gave everybody the rules of the contest, the Strange New Worlds contest that Pocket Books ran for a decade. They gave you rules of what you could and couldn't do, and you could not introduce new relatives of the crew and that kind of thing.
Right.
So I thought, well, how can I write a story that dances as close to that line as I possibly can? And I have to confess, as I wrote that story for Kirstie Alley's Saavik, not for Robin Curtis's. But because you can only wonder how might Kirstie Alley have delivered lines like "Admiral David is dead," and that conversation with David, where Saavik's taking him to task for his use of protomatter, which is that is a beautiful scene.
And I think she's great at it. That's one of the scenes I'm thinking of that I like her a lot. Yeah.
So so yes, in all seriousness, I think they both are fine Saaviks.
They are.
But I had a kid crush on Kirstie Alley as Saavik, so she's always my Saavik. So
hey,
I just
you're
always
far from
wonder,
alone.
gosh, what could have been? What could have been? I think what her agent was trying to get more money for her for Star Trek 3. She would have been happy, as I understand it, to have gone back, but she'd done the North and South miniseries, and her star was rising clearly, and well.
Her star was rising, but it wasn't trekking. Oh,
nicely done, sir.
You're welcome. So I will answer for Tim. Tim saw Star Trek 3 first, so Robin Curtis is his Saavik. So
all right,
there you go. All right. Well, cool. Well, sir, I really appreciate you being here. This has been fantastic.
My pleasure. It's been fun.
If ever I have to, fly without my wingman, it's nice to know I have someone like you I can call to come and help. So I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And of course, since we are kind of winging this at the moment, we don't know exactly what's going on next week. So I'll keep you posted, I guess. And hey, if you have any ideas for next week, let us know. Now, of course, there are lots of things that I'm looking at, but I definitely, if I get an idea from the audience, I'll be very inclined to look at doing it. So in the meantime, I hope you will like, share, comment, and subscribe, and also be sure to send in your questions. Gospel According to Star Trek on Twitter and Facebook, or gospeltrekpodcast@gmail.com. We would love to discuss your question on the show. That's going to wrap it up for this edition of the Gospel According to Star Trek podcast. Thank you so much for being here. Until next time, I am Kevin Sinise. My guest host has been Mike Poteet. And as Jesus said in John 10:10, live long and prosper. See you next time.